welcome everybody. I want to thank Robert again for the great talk this morning. And it's true that Philadelphia really is a city with great history. And in fact, last night I got to my hotel room after the reception, and I noticed this strange black shiny box on the wall. It's almost as old and antiquated as that cracked bell down the block. I believe it's something archaeologists call a television. And I think once upon a time, supposedly they say it had these big antenna ears, and there were just 3 channels to choose from. ABC, NBC, CBS. Do you guys remember that? Well, I don't remember it, but I'm told that that's the way it used to be. Now, of course, there are 300 or 3,000 channels to choose from. Still nothing on. So we come now, and after I noticed this wonderful artifact on my wall, I opened up my laptop, clicked on my Netflix account, and picked up the episode of The Great British Baking Show that I've been watching on my Apple TV at home the night before. A show created by the BBC, first broadcast in the US on PBS, and now licensed by Netflix for on-demand streaming to end-user customers. So TV, as we know it, has undergone all kinds of fundamental changes. Who creates content, how it's licensed to distributors, how it's distributed to consumers, how and where we access it, how people get paid for it. So in publishing, we have something somewhat similar now. We used to have the 3 big publishers. But in publishing, it kind of went in the opposite way, right? It was a lot of smaller publishers absorbed by the big 3. So it's kind of an inverse where many were absorbed into one. And with the announced merger of McGraw-Hill and Cengage, there may soon be 2. But I think, and as we go through this hour, I think we all are familiar with the way television content has changed and how we consume it and how we use it. And we're seeing a lot of the same trends in publishing. And that's what we're going to be focused on here. So even the 3 big publishers have evolved in recent years. So now we have the same players, but some new angles, right? McGraw-Hill is no longer just a textbook publisher. They have this thing called Connect, this interactive component. Similar, Pearson has MyLab. Cengage Unlimited has gone a whole other way. The general idea, a student buys a book, they're really buying a whole lot more. It's not just a book or an e-book, it's a whole digital learning platform, where once there were separate study guides and add-ons, now everything is bundled with the book. So what does this mean for authors? What is a book in the context of a digital learning platform? And actually, is the student buying anything? It's usually more often a license that they get for a semester or for a year. Sorry, I can't see all my notes. Did we lose him? All right, I'll keep going. But and so then you have something like Cengage Unlimited, which is at a whole other level, because now it's brought something like the Netflix subscription or Spotify subscription model into publishing, where for a single flat fee, a student can access their entire catalog for the semester. Okay, that's what I'm finding. Okay. I don't want it to advance on these. Okay. Okay. Okay, that's okay. So why the move to Cengage Unlimited? Well, we know they went through a bankruptcy a few years ago. There's been a lot of loud student protests about the high cost of textbooks, meaning that professors and institutions are under pressure to find lower cost options. There were also some federal laws passed requiring lower cost options. And I think it's also a recognition that students are really growing up in this world of subscriptions, right? They subscribe to Netflix. They don't own cars, they rent zip cars. They don't own CDs and albums, they stream their music on Spotify. So this model fits, the Cengage Unlimited model fits with how they consume content and how they use their devices. Now, whether consuming content is the same as learning is a whole other question that I'll encourage you to discuss in other sessions. Okay, and then you get to the YouTube. Unlimited channels. Anybody can be a producer and a director. And of course, there are never any legal problems when people put things on YouTube. I'm kidding, of course. There have been some very notable copyright infringement cases coming out of YouTube over the last several years. So if that is something you use in the course of your teaching, you want to make sure that when you post content here, you do read over their terms of service and their copyright guidelines. And especially when it comes to music, which is where some of the litigation has come from, they've actually added a lot of useful guidance there, both on public domain kind of music you can use that's been allowed for it, and also you can now plug in songs and check what kind of license they've given for use on YouTube. Okay, and then we also have, if you want to don't want to deal with publishers, you want to publish it yourself. So this is kind of like YouTube in the publishing arena, right? You can write and publish your book and put it out there for the world. I think it began with Lulu, but now, as in so many other things, Amazon seems to be taking over. And then to the final Wild West frontier. The ultimate in low-cost teaching materials is no-cost teaching materials. We have open access materials often put on, on OER. They're governed by Creative Commons licenses, which I'll get to in a little while. But there's no cost, but at what price in terms of quality? And at what cost to you as the author in terms of your uncompensated time? Also, if you create and post your book or your materials here, you still have legal rights and obligations that you need to take care of. So what does this all mean? Going back to the sailing metaphor. Are we in for smooth sailing? Are we capsizing? Or is it a total Titanic? Yes, ma'am. Oh, a question?
Will you be addressing the concerns of open access, where as an author I have the privilege of paying you several hundreds of dollars for you to publish my work so all of you can read my stuff for free?
So you talk about like vanity publishing, or?
It's not vanity. I'm convinced it's a scam because the latest iteration of this was I was invited because of my stellar writing ability to be a guest editor, guest lead editor for this publishing company. And the wonder of it was I got to name the special edition. I had the privilege of creating my own peer review team, and my piece would be free, but anybody else whose work I brought on board that I solicited, they would get a 10% discount. And it only cost them $800, but my piece would be free. And I wrote back and I said, I don't work for free. What author would want to publish what author would want to pay you to publish my work for free and I get nothing for it? So is that something you're going to be talking about?
That one's new to me. I mean, what I'm talking about are either publishing contracts where you get paid in one way or another, that we'll get into in a minute, or places where you sell your work either through self-publishing or give it away for free for OER. I think anytime you are being asked to pay to publish your own work, you should really run in the other direction. So, looking at all of this from a legal perspective, I would say it's an old dog, but it's new tricks, right? We have in law, the really big governing parts of law in publishing are contract law and copyright law. And contract law, we all know, goes as far back as human history. And even copyright law predates things like telephones, much less recorded music and film, never mind computers and the internet. So the law will find a way to catch up. Not always well, and not as fast as some people would like, but contract and copyright law really have proven themselves surprisingly adaptable to technological changes. So we're going to focus most of today on contract law because that's really what runs through all of this. I'm going to pull in some copyright principles. If we have time at the end, we can go a little deeper into copyright law, but I think we're going to get to a lot of it because it all is so interwoven. So let's go back. I'm going to go back to my first day of contract law in law school, to the fundamentals of what makes a contract. It's really very simple. It's an agreement between two people. One makes an offer, the other accepts the offer to do or pay something for an exchange of value called consideration between them. You enter into contracts all the time. If you buy a ticket to the movies, you sign a cell phone contract, you click I accept to access software on the website, to download an app. Just because nobody reads the contracts doesn't mean you're not signing them and that they're not enforceable. So in the publishing world, it's typically you are all authors. But a rose by any other name. You are all still writing in your area of expertise, but the terminology has been changing, and with that, some possible legal changes too. So are you an author? Are you a subject matter expert, or a content provider, or a pedagogue? However you see yourself, recognize that how the publisher perceives you will affect how they approach the contract. An author tends to mean one thing. It's the autonomous creator, the hub of the wheel from which everything else flows. Whereas I would argue that a content provider or subject matter expert is just one spoke of the wheel, along with all the other contributions to a project. And I'm thinking of something like a digital learning platform, right, a MindTap or Connect, you have the content of the book, but it's built into a much larger learning platform where there are interactive components, where there are study aids built in, there might be video, there might be feedback tests for the student. So the text is just one part of that. And so I think these conceptions shape how the publisher and the author view and value their respective roles and contributions. And I'm going to just say right now, I'm not going to take a position if there's right or better way to be in this role. People have many different reasons for writing textbooks, different financial goals and constraints, different options, different leverage, frankly, in the marketplace. And we all know the industry has undergone sea changes in the last several years, so that options that were the norm 20 years ago just may not be on the table. But I will say that I think a large number of the conflicts and disputes I've seen over the last several years has really been a misalignment between the parties and how they view the role of the person who's writing the text. And it also, frankly, it's when a publisher has changed their conception of the author's role and where they fit in that wheel, but the contract between them hasn't changed. So, yeah, okay. So let's talk about, we'll go to traditional contracts. I'm talking about the royalty contracts people sign with publishers, where the author writes a book, they give a grant in the rights to the book to be published, usually gets revised every 3 years. They're paid on royalties, either a flat rate or escalating. So I want to think about, I was thinking about like that digital learning platform and all those components, all those spokes on the wheel. So older traditional contracts were often a bit fuzzy on what was required versus what authors volunteered to do in support of their brand. So you get language like this. The author also agrees to prepare and deliver at the author's sole cost and expense instructor's manual, solutions manual, test items, material for a website, and such other items as may be specified, collectively ancillary materials. So you get that kind of catch-all kitchen sink language. And I think even if authors weren't required to create all these, the reality is so many authors are not satisfied with the quality of ancillaries when the publisher brings in a freelance or an in-house person to write them. They end up spending a lot of their own time fixing and revising them to protect the integrity of the overall product. And so if you don't have a separate contract for all those additional tasks, it's all viewed as being covered by your royalty stream, with the idea being that the more the author invests in the quality of the overall product and all of its parts, the more sales will increase and they'll earn more in the long run. So kind of like if you own the ship, you're more likely to fix it, you're more likely to invest in it and maintain its overall value. Now, if you're just hired to work on the crew for a season, you don't care so much. You just want to do your job and get home after you get paid. So the new thing we're seeing, well, not these contracts have been around forever, but in publishing somewhat new for authors, are the work for hire kinds of contracts. So the way these are structured, it's often a master agreement that lays out the basic terms and conditions for the relationship, and then individual statements of work get attached to that broad agreement. And each of these statements of work covers a single discrete project that will be independently paid for. So you might have one SOW that you sign just to write the work the first time. Or you might be hired to write 5 chapters. You might be a content provider for some content that's going into a larger work. But so you want to think about the fact that this master agreement may be governing your relationship through several projects. So you want to read and review it carefully, because this might be your best chance to negotiate some of those terms. Similarly with the SOW, what you really want to think about, because this will spell out tasks much more specifically than those old contracts with the kitchen sink kind of language. So you want to think about what you're committing to do on what time frame and how you're going to be paid, because we're no longer in the world of royalties where it's going to depend on sales. Well, it may be, but assuming it's a flat fee kind of payment structure. It's rarely all up front. It's usually broken into chunks to align with different stages of the project. So you want to define your task carefully. You want to think about how much time each of those tasks is going to take you, and then work out the payment for that. So how do we know what kind of a contract we're looking at? Because, and as I'll get to in a minute, you can have royalty payments on a work for hire contract, and you can have flat fee payments for a traditional contract. Those can be changed. So you want to separate ownership concepts from payment concepts. So I want to focus right now on ownership. So a work for hire contract is really a commission. So you have language like this. The material has been commissioned by publisher as a work for hire. The publisher will be deemed the author of the material as an employer for hire, and copyright in the material will belong to the publisher. What does this mean? It means you're assigning copyright. You're not the owner anymore. It's like I might hire a web designer to build a website for me. They're going to assign me the website when they're done. This is exactly the same kind of structure. It means you don't own it. you can't reuse it, you have no continuing stake in the book. So if you wanted to use parts of this book, you would need to ask for permission just like I would, just like anybody else would. There's generally no revision right unless that's spelled out in the contract. But I will say, you know, things like not being able to use the work, those are things that are negotiable. You know, the main thing publishers don't want is you undercutting sales of it. But there's a lot of, obviously this is your field, this is your content. There are ways you can negotiate some use rights, especially if you're helping to market the book, or if you need it for use in non-competitive things like PowerPoint presentations or in some scholarly articles. All of that is possible to negotiate and make a permission you have in the agreement. So now, how do you know that you're not dealing with work for hire, that you are still in some way the copyright owner? You'll see this kind of language, which is much more traditional in a publishing contract. You grant to the publisher for the full term of copyright of the work and all renewals, exclusive right to publish, sell, license the work in English and other languages throughout the world. Now that sure sounds like everything, right? I mean, have we held back anything? Well, first of all, sometimes you can hold back some things. Sometimes we hold back other foreign language rights, or only from some countries. But this is not an assignment of copyright in the same way. It's not being commissioned, and ownership's not being assigned to the publisher. It is a very broad, exclusive, long-term license, but it's not permanent in the way a work for hire is. Now, how do you know? Besides this language, are there any other clues? Yes. Somewhere else in this contract, you should find language that if the book goes out of print, the rights revert to the author. And that's your clue, right? That if the publisher is no longer selling it, that's when the license ends, and that's when the rights come back to you. They don't own it at the end. And I will say that under copyright law, no matter how broad the grant language is, you also have some statutory rights to terminate this at some later date that were built into the Copyright Act. There are a lot of restrictions and requirements of that, and I'm going to be doing a webinar on that in the fall, so I'm not going to get into those now. Okay, so I'm going to take a sip of water. All right, so one of the questions, because it might be a temporary, you know, if we're talking about a statement of work for a commissioned work, is whether you have any long-term rights in this. If you write it once and they own it forever, you know, what happens? So future editions, in a traditional contract, the author usually, you had language that if the publisher wanted to revise, they could do that, and they would call on the author to do so. Often the publisher has a right to decide if they want you to do the revision. So here's some ways you might see this language. The agreement may be renewed for additional one-year terms upon the written mutual agreement of the parties. Or revision. The publisher gives the, well, this is now in the work for hire context. So traditional was simply, we're going to revise, all the same contract terms will apply. That's all the language you needed. In a commission contract, it's a little different because you might not have a right to revise. So these are ways they might try to address that the parties can renew the agreement if they want to. Or the publisher will give the consultant a right of first refusal to participate on substantially the same terms. So basically importing that idea of we're going to carry forward all the same terms to revisions. And these both look kind of straightforward, right? The trouble is, both of these lines showed up in the same contract, 3 pages apart. So how do you know how these work together? Are we renewing for one-year terms of the contract or for each revision of the work? Are the terms the same or substantially the same, or are they open to renegotiations? You know, you don't usually have this problem in traditional contracts, but when you see something like this and you can't understand it, this is when you need to ask those questions. Because if the publisher can't explain to you how these two clauses are supposed to work together, then you're just setting yourselves up for a problem. So, and I want to just say, you know, I think authors, and I was talking with somebody last night, are often nervous about asking these kinds of questions when negotiating a contract. You're so excited to have a publisher interested, you want to sign, you want to get going, or you're scared that they'll think you're difficult. And the last thing you want to do is be labeled difficult before you've even signed. What I would say is you don't have to make this antagonistic. All you want is some clarification. If you're confused by the terms, and you're all smart people, if they're confusing, then you can ask questions. And if they can't explain it or don't understand it, then it's much easier for you to work together to clean up that language and make it clearer for everybody. So, you know, contract language, when you are sent a contract, it's not set in stone until it's signed. Another issue that comes up is the right to compete. So often a traditional contract will have language that the author can't do write any competing or publish any competing work after this work comes out because they don't want you undercutting their sales. Now, if you are being signed on and you think you're going to be on there for 11 editions, that's probably okay. But if this is a work for hire and you're doing this once and then you're going on to the next project within a year, this could really hold you back. So you want to try to narrow this term. First of all, you don't want to have it be on the publisher's sole judgment. That's really, what in the world does that mean? Words like reasonable judgment or is not reasonably viewed as competitive. And the reason is that the word reasonable has legal meaning to it. It means that you have to look at some sort of industry standard of what is reasonable. So it's much less unfettered than the publisher's sole judgment. And also, and this is true in a traditional contract or a work for hire, you can narrow the scope of what it is to be competitive. You want to maybe narrow it to a similar audience or level. So if you're writing an introductory textbook at the college level on this topic, you want to say, I won't write a competing introductory level textbook at the college level. You don't want to close off K through 12. You may not want to close off higher level, and maybe narrow the topic. If your field is economics, well, you don't want to close yourself off from writing anything else in the field. And also, you want to make clear, and it's pretty easy to add language on this, that things you do in the course of your career in your field, presentations, articles, blog posts, and so on, are not competitive. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how payment works in these different models. And again, as I said earlier, we want to separate copyright and ownership from questions of payment because these things can, in fact, be untethered. So although it's rarer for a work for hire to be paid on a it's rarer for it to be paid on royalties. It's usually paid on a flat or hourly rate, but sometimes it does get paid on a royalty structure. And a traditional author contract is as I said, is almost always paid on royalties, but I have seen at times we've been able to negotiate payment for a flat fee payment on a single edition. This is obviously a lot easier to do if you have an established sales record, so you can draw on that. And it's only negotiated for a single edition. And you certainly need some leverage to be able to do something like that, but it can be done. And I've also started to see hybrid models, where some tasks are paid on flat or hourly fees, while others are paid by royalties. For example, if you're creating part of that digital learning platform, an architecture system, you might get royalties on that. That's a larger product that you're going to be creating. But you might also be a subject matter expert in part of what's going to be on there, and you may be one of several subject matter experts contributing content that's going to be in the platform, and you might have a work for hire for that writing that you do. I've also seen it where an author has a traditional royalty contract, but she was determined to have better study guides accompany it. And so she said with her publisher, well, you're going to be hiring a freelancer to do this anyway. Hire me, pay me what you would have paid the freelancer. And so she had a separate contract for her ancillaries. Okay, so let's talk a little about royalties, the traditional way of calculating payment on contracts. Here are some different language you might see in a contract. 15% of net sales. So if your ebook sells for $100, you get $15 on that. Or 11% of net sales if the book or any portion thereof is bundled with another product. Or if it's a custom product, in conjunction with any other work as part of a database or other product, authored to be paid on a pro rata basis, such pro rata to be determined in the publisher's reasonable judgment. So raise your hand if you don't see any red flags here. All right, so let's break it down a little. What is net? Is that term defined anywhere in the contract? We want to know what that is net of, because you can push a lot of things into net to really push that number down. What is a bundle? And are net sales now just on the part of the bundle that constitutes your work, or are you getting paid on the whole bundle? And if it's being prorated, how is that being done? Is it based on page count? Is it based on word count? If we're in a digital learning platform, do we have pages? If we have interactive components that go with it, there may be no pages to speak of. One way we've also seen it is that they assign list price values to the components of a bundle and then prorate on those, which could make sense, but one might argue, and I'm sure Julie would, that some of these don't really get sold in a standalone way. Your book might sell, your ebook might sell on its own, but the questions that are built on the text have no value in the marketplace independent of their being offered with your book. But if the publisher could say, well, we think that's worth 20% of the bundle, so we're going to prorate based on what the price of your standalone work is in the context of that bundle. What is reasonable judgment? We've already covered that. It's better, but it's still open to question. And then in this custom product, now custom, as I used to understand it, meant professor at a certain university could say, I want 6 chapters of that book, 5 of that, 7 of this. We're going to put it in a package customized for me to use in my classroom. But here now we've put that database word in there in custom. So now, does that mean a subscription service? Are we talking about Cengage Unlimited? You know, so I would say there's no one answer to any of these questions. But if you don't know, again, you need to ask and get some answers. And you need to get some definitions of what these terms are going to mean in your contract. And once you get those answers and you get those definitions, those can and should be incorporated into the contract as term definitions, so that we define the term net is going to mean this, and then whenever we see the word net, that's what it means in the contract. Because what you're ultimately thinking about is if there is ever a dispute, a judge is going to have to look at this contract and try to understand or guess what the parties meant when the contract was formed, or even if the parties were thinking the same thing when the contract was formed. So, and the thing is, emails you might exchange with your editor clarifying these terms are not legally binding. The contract is what's going to govern. They might be useful, they might look to them for guidance, but ultimately what's in the contract is most important, and that's why you want to understand what you don't understand, get clarification of that, and then make sure those defined terms make their way back into the contract. Yes, ma'am.
I thought emails were legally binding.
No. The contract that is signed between the parties is what is legally binding. And there's usually language in your contract that will say this contract can only be amended by a signed written amendment by the parties that they actually sign. Now, going back to what I said at the beginning, offer and acceptance, right? I mean, I can form a contract with somebody over email, but I write and you accept. I say, I'll pay you, $10,000 for your used car. You accept, I pay, we have a contract. But in your contract, there will also be language that says this contract supersedes any prior communications between the parties. And that's why you want to make sure those definitions, the things you've discussed on email, actually make their way back into the contract. It's a great question. Okay. So let's now talk about payment on a service contract. So this can often be much more simple. It can be worked on an hourly basis, that you estimate so many hours you're going to spend on the project and you get paid so much per hour and you send invoices documenting your time. Or it might be that there's a project fee. It's broken up into chunks based on parts of the project, and then you get paid on your invoices. So there are a lot of upsides to this, right? No royalties, a steady, predictable paycheck now versus 3 years from now or more when the book actually comes out. You don't have to look at royalty statements. You don't have to worry about pro-rationing. What's a custom publication? What's a subscription? What's this going to look like in 20 years? None of that is your concern. On the downside is that there's no cashing in if the book breaks big, right? And the publisher is often willing to push some of the, the risk forward and pay you more on theoretical future earnings versus out of pocket right now. So you're likely to earn a lot less now, but it's, the bird in hand versus two in the bush. But so true for the publisher as well, which is why they want to pay less when they're the one doing the paying. Okay, so here's some language I saw in a service contract recently. How are they going to be paid? Upon delivery and acceptance by the publisher of the portions of the assignment prepared during those hours, submission by the consultant of a written statement documenting days and hours the consultant worked on the assignment. That looks fine, nicely legal. The problem is the consultant wasn't paid for over 7 months, despite all the timely submission of invoices. And we're talking about a semester where he was working on this. So when you are invoicing, or actually when you're negotiating the terms for these contracts, you want to specify a payout schedule and a turnaround time for payment. So think carefully about the language of the payment terms. Ideally, it's automatically. Upon completion, you send it in, they send a paycheck. But that's unlikely to happen. More often, it might be after they've had a chance to review and approve it. But you want to have a defined window of time for them to review and approve, so it doesn't sit in their inbox for 3 months. You say, in 20 days or whatever to review and approve. And then, fine, then you submit your invoice. How soon after submission will you get paid? It's 30 days after submission of the invoice. And again, assume nothing, ask questions, and then make sure the contract spells it all out. And ideally, I would recommend, you want to make it a condition that copyright in the delivered materials will not be assigned to the publisher until you receive your payment. That will give you some control over the situation. So let's sum up all of this, you know, we want to define the author's role in the project. We want to think about things like a right to participate in future editions, where and how we can renegotiate terms, certainty of income now versus sharing later, the ups and downs of that, time commitment, loss of other income or opportunities, and how that factors into your decisions, and ultimately trying to anticipate changes in the industry in terms of what kind of contract works better. And I will just say that, you know, most publishers are not jumping into what Cengage and Pearson are doing in terms of subscription services and digital learning. They're mostly still publishing more traditional books. And most of them are sticking with their royalty-based contracts. So I think, you know, we don't know if that trend, how that's going to go. I think they're probably waiting to see how the big do in those, when they test the waters. But, you know, you want to think about how your contract will play out in the long term. So I want to pause here for a moment, because that's sort of the end of with publisher kinds of contracts that I want to talk about. And I actually want to invite Sean Wakely to weigh in a little bit. He and I had a great conversation about some of these things a few weeks ago. You know, he is a publisher, and I want to get the publisher's perspective on how they view authors in this context, what factors or pressures the publisher is considering when they weigh and decide what kind of contract to offer authors, what kind of terms. Because I think it's easy to get into a us versus them mentality, or to think they're just trying to screw me. And I think it's important to understand the position the other party is in. Both because you are going to work with these people, ideally, for many years, and you want to have a positive relationship, but also, you know, any negotiation where you better understand the pressures of the other person in the negotiation, you're more likely to have a positive outcome.
So was there anything in particular, Brenda, you wanted me to kind of start with?
I think in the royalty versus flat fee kind of.
Yeah, I think you captured that really well, in that it's all about risk. And if a publisher ends up paying money up front, it has to be reasonably confident that it's going to recover it in the end. And a royalty represents shared risk. And that's why I think a royalty arrangement is much more consistent with a grant of rights agreement than it is with a work made for hire or assignment agreement. And I think you know, as you pointed out, Brenda, it doesn't have to be that a work made for hire has to be a royalty, but it tends to be that way because really what you're doing is partnering together to make this work, publish this work, market the work, and you both have, you know, the old saying, skin in the game. And if the book is successful, a royalty arrangement allows the author to also benefit. So it's a little bit of a calculation on your part if you are in, I think, still a very unusual position of being offered the choice between a royalty arrangement or a work made for hire. It's kind of looking at what the upside opportunity is on the end of the other end of it.
And do you have any thoughts on, you know, the right to revise and how that plays out long term? The contracts that I've typically worked with have been grant of rights contracts. I'm currently working with Flatworld Publishing, but I've previously worked with Pearson, Houghton Mifflin College, Thomson Learning, Cengage. Typically, I work with royalty-based agreements for the main text. It's usually the supplements that accompany the text that are prepared according to a work made for hire or an assignment agreement. So I'm Okay. Does anybody have questions for Sean or me before we go into non-publisher-based contracts? I saw a hand in the back there.
Hi, my name's Mark Simmons. I'm from University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. How common is it to do an upfront payment, right, prior for creation of the work, and then have that all set by royalties once they kick in?
yes, the advance. The advance against future royalties. That's, in my experience, becoming less and less common. It's not like it doesn't exist anymore, but a lot of publishers are now not in the same financial position they used to be in. The industry has shifted and changed. And again, that advance represents a lot more risk for the publisher. And there's an idea among authors in the textbook publishing industry, and sometimes it's driven by the trade publishing industry because you hear about these large advances, that if the publisher makes a large advance, it means it's going to work that much harder to try to earn it back. But the way that most publishing operations are these days, they're large enough where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And the sales force doesn't know how much advance was paid out on that project. They don't know. A lot of the marketing takes place according to kind of a factory model in the larger publishers, at least, where the project moves along through various stages: writing, development, production, marketing, and each of them run according to their own track. And what really drives behavior is the designation on that book about whether it's a high priority book, often called a AAA or AA book, based on the enrollment size of the course area for which it's targeted. That is mainly what is driving the behavior.
Would it be unreasonable to ask for an advance?
It's never unreasonable to ask for one, no. And the way that most advances are calculated is the publisher has an idea of about how many copies it plans to sell during the first year of publication and over the life of publication. And every house has a kind of a different way of calculating it, but the royalty then is based on whatever the percentage. You kind of figure out what the book is likely to generate in royalties, and then maybe that's a quarter would be the maximum, or half. Smaller publishers like Flat World, I'll just say up front, we don't generally pay advances because our free cash is being used to invest in hiring more sales reps to get that sales model working. But, and some of the larger publishers have actually started just not even acquiring anymore. So the competition for authors is a lot less fierce. You're in a much better position when you have multiple publishers bidding on your project. That's when those kinds of terms are more likely to be on the table.
Could you expand on what you just said about publishers not acquiring any longer? And I just want to make sure I understood that.
Well, and this is all anecdotal for me, right? But like Pearson, McGraw, Cengage, for the most part, what I've heard from peers who are still working there is that their goals for acquiring new product have tapered off dramatically. And in many cases, they don't even have goals anymore because they have so much product. They don't need more product at the current time. It's really the smaller publishers that are more aggressively acquiring because they're growing their lists. But when you look at Cengage and McGraw-Hill coming together, they actually have so much product that the Justice Department, when they evaluate that merger for acceptance to provide what they call a consent decree to go ahead with the merger, they're going to have to go through course by course and justify to the Justice Department why they should be able to keep all of these books in the catalog. And some of them will have to be forced divestitures as a result before the Justice Department will approve the merger. I mean, that's the situation they're in. Pearson is also in a situation where they have, I mean, I'm not saying that they don't acquire anything anymore, but versus 10 to 20 years ago, it's a fraction of the new projects that they're signing up anymore, and they're all very targeted.
My publisher has its own marketing department, and while I have been invited to suggest schools, universities to pick up my book, I'm not mandated to. So, I mean, logically, it seems it would behoove both of us for sales if I helped out. So it's my first book. Can you address that in any way? Is this a typical thing where?
I think it's typical to ask, and I think it's typical to partner with an author. I mean, some authors, Kevin has a great social media presence. You're putting out a lot of posts, and that is kind of like a publishing partnership dream, that the publisher could partner with the author to mutually support one another's messaging. That's just great. And I would actually look and point to what Kevin is doing with his books to kind of give you an idea of what you could do. I'm not even sure, though, if you're coordinating really with your publisher, but in the ideal world, Kevin, that's what would be happening, is that their social media would be picking up and reposting yours and retweeting, and it would kind of be, that whole thing. There's a lot of marketing research that goes on. In some cases, you'll find some sources that say you need to contact a customer 11 times before you can actually close a sale. I've seen somewhere where it's 6. But the whole point is you're building the brand for your book. The more you can get out there, the more people, you can activate people's almost subconscious memory to say, oh, I'm kind of familiar with that. It's not a new thing for me to try to get my head wrapped around. If you're doing that as an author, you're helping that marketing effort get those touches so that when a person is about ready to make a decision, it feels familiar to them that, you know, your book has kind of entered the scaffolding of the way they think. That's really helpful.
I would just add on to that. I mean, I haven't seen as much in textbook, but in trade, publishers say they won't even look at an author if they don't have a social media platform already, you know, for a novel or anything like that. You have to have your blog and your website and your Twitter presence, and those can become obligations in the contract to participate on those. Yeah. Okay.
I would say, even though this is not part of the contract, but every author should be a maximum aggressive with marketing and sales people. And you review the competition, you know the niche that your book has satisfied, spreadsheets of comparison, talking points by chapter or overall with the buzzwords that are key to your discipline. These marketing people write up copy that has none of the buzzword or flavor of the discipline, and push into that. Oftentimes you'll find there's this nebulous space, and if you don't push, they'll come in and fill it up with their stuff. And so I would say be aggressive with that. And again, with comparison with competition, with defining your place, and you know it best. And I used to submit just horrendous marketing turnouts to my editor, and they would always be amazed. But you just push against that. Don't let that go.
I'm going to use that as my jumping off point now into self-publishing, because at this point, you are the publisher, you are the marketing department, you are everything, and then you take on all those obligations yourself. And I think it's already been evolving, as we were just discussing here, that the author takes on more and more of this. But now, you know, you're responsible for publishing, marketing, editing, permissions, everything. So now, you know, there's no contract to sign with yourself, right? I'll make myself an offer I can't refuse. But really, you know, no author is an island, and contracts will still be very much a part of your work. You know, permissions. Sometimes a publisher, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, hi. I guess I'm probably an oxymoron here because I have 30 years experience of marketing and advertising, and I just joined education 3 years ago, so I'm here to find out information about actually publishing a book. What I would say to people who actually are aspiring authors or existing authors, you have to go with your gut with what you're trying to say with your platform for your book. And you know it better, you know how to market yourself better than anybody. So even if you have a publishing house that's set up and they have a marketing team, because I've done sales and marketing, you definitely have to go with your gut because you know your product better than anybody.
Yeah, and I've certainly heard plenty of authors complain over the years how little their publisher is doing to market their book. Nobody's ever complained that there's, you know, too much. So, you know, let's think about contracts when you self-publish. Permissions, obviously, for text or photos. And even in a traditional contract, this was often the author's responsibility, but the publisher gave you their forms or they had to approve it. And sometimes they might help pick up the costs of getting permissions. But now that's all a cost to you, both in terms of money paid for any permissions, but also the time and effort. And, you know, and then there's really paying for anything you don't feel like doing, whether it's layout, whether it's hiring an editor to look over it. You're either going to have to spend your time or you're going to have to spend your money. And if you're spending money, if you're bringing in anybody else, then you want to have, there's going to be a contract to cover that. So who really are you contracting with when you're self-publishing? So as I said before, any click-wrap agreement, as they're called legally, where you click to accept the terms of an agreement, is a contract. And that could be for goods, like images from iStock or elsewhere that you might put into your book. It could be with the Copyright Clearance Center if you're getting permissions to use something. It could be for services if you're hiring somebody to build your website, to build your, to help you lay out the book. So now, you know, kind of putting on the copyright lens, protecting your own work and respecting copyright of others is now your sole cost and responsibility. All right, but I want to talk a little about self-publishing. So, as I said before, Amazon seems to be, you know, building its market share. I'm curious if anybody in the room has self-published their books? And which platforms did you use for that? KDP, okay. Which is part of Amazon.
I did create space also, but not a textbook.
Okay. And Ingram, okay. Yeah. Which one?
Smashwords.
Okay. Smashwords. Okay. Yep, and KDP is Kindle Direct Publishing. So, I went and took a look at the Amazon self-publishing contract. So I'm going to walk through that a little bit, but really whichever one you choose, and you heard several just now, you really want to review and understand it before you sign, or really more likely before you click. But, one major already, and sometimes you'll see some of the same clauses you would see in a traditional publishing contract, and some things look quite different. But one of the big differences right off the bat is that none of these are up for discussion or negotiation. So you just put aside everything I said about all the things you want to negotiate and have the discussion with the publishers. No, it's a take it or leave it contract. I'll just be upfront. Because these are not negotiated, I've not spent a lot of time reviewing them because people don't usually hire me to review contracts that can't be negotiated. So I'll give you a cursory overview of some notable highlights and how things differ or are the same as traditional, but certainly weigh in if you've had experience. And I would say, especially when it comes to the royalty schemes, I've tried to get my head around them, but for those of you who have actually done it, I definitely welcome your input. Okay, so Kindle Direct Publishing, which is Amazon's mechanism, a lot of the usual clauses are there. There's a royalty clause. And those rates are set, and they won't be changed without notice. And we'll get to more of the details of that in a minute. In their contract, their payment schedules, they pay 60 days after the month when the sale was made. They do allow for payment disputes. A traditional contract, you might have an audit clause. So here, it has to be brought within six months after getting the statement. There can be a legal proceeding. However, they make clear in their contract the payment will be limited to the actual amount, if any, that's owed to you. There's no interest, there's no recovering audit fees, there's none of that. It's just straight up, if we made a mistake, this is what we owe you. Authors are responsible for all rights clearances. It has to represent and warrant that they have all those clearances, which is often similar to publishing contracts. If you look at your contract, you are usually representing and warranting that you have all necessary rights and permissions for the content and will have gotten that permission. So that's same language here. Offsets, Amazon can offset losses, which is usually from returns, against future payments. So there's often similar language to this in a publishing contract that we call the cross-collateralization clause. So they can offset losses from one of your books against income on another. And then there's the general terms and conditions, things like dispute resolution, what state's law applies. There's this thing called force majeure, that if we get hit by a tornado, the contract still stands. There's that kind of language, and it's fairly standard in the Amazon contract. But then there are also some interesting differences. So Amazon, as I said, you accept it or you don't accept it. There's no negotiation. Amazon has the right to amend the contract at any time, and they don't have to notify you if they make these changes. So the burden is on you to go and check the contract periodically. So the one I'm going through was posted in August 2018. It's still up there as of now, but if it changes, the terms of your agreement may be changed. Now, they have a couple caveats on that related to royalties and the grant of rights. There you have a 30-day window. It's not going to go into effect immediately. They still aren't going to notify you, but it's not an automatic change to your contract. But even then, in that 30-day window, your options are to withdraw or to accept the term. So, you can check it any time you like, but you can never leave. Termination. Now, this is, a noticeable difference. Oh, oops, sorry. You can terminate, i.e. withdraw your book at any time. So this is obviously vastly different from a normal publishing contract, which can be binding for the life of copyright, or a work for hire where you assign all rights to the publisher. Here, you own your book. You never assign ownership. If you want to take it out, you take it out that day. You still get paid for any sales up until that point. Marketing and promotion. So we were talking a lot about that. Most traditional contracts are pretty silent on that. And authors just silently fume about what the publisher is doing. Here, Amazon says it has total autonomy over promotion within the program. So they do a lot to make these books sell well within their universe. But of course, you can take the link and put it on your website and put it in your blog and circulate it to drive sales to Amazon. You get to set the price for your book. That's also quite different from a traditional contract where authors have no say, and there's been a lot of disputes about, not necessarily legal, but disagreements with publishers about pricing and what it's done to the industry. There is some language that they have the right to match a competitor price because Amazon has so many third-party sales happening within its universe that they have the right to kind of adjust if they're getting undercut by a third-party reseller on their platform. Okay, so royalties. The general standard, they break it between digital and print. Digital, they have a basic 35% royalty to authors. And then they have a special one that is an option, which is a 70% royalty. So I don't know what I would pick. Do I want 35 or do I want 70? But obviously the 70 is subject to some certain pricing restrictions. Mainly it's that the book has to be priced between $2.99 and $9.99, which for many of you might not be very attractive. For print books, it's 60% for a standard sale to a regular customer, 40% if they're selling to libraries or booksellers. And then they calculate that on the list price minus the printing costs.
On the digital pricing, 70% royalty, they have a rule that you can't give it away on your own site. And I run an online course where I give the book away, so I can't put it in the 70% royalty category.
Yeah. Thank you. Now they also have another option they call Kindle Select Publishing. This is sort of their higher level trim of their publishing options. The restriction is you have to be exclusive to them, so you can't sell the book anywhere else on any other platforms, which you can under the direct model. But it can lead to some preferential royalty terms. I've tried to exactly determine what these are, but they seem to change fairly frequently. And I think it's because they're trying to entice authors to sign on, and so they're reacting to what they're hearing and what makes it. The biggest thing is that you need to be enrolled in Select if you want to be part of their subscription services. And these are kind of like Cengage Unlimited. They have Kindle Unlimited, where people with their Kindle can access anything within the universe there. They also have something called Kindle Owners Lending Library, where people who have bought the book can loan it out. But I would note the difference, with Cengage Unlimited, which launched subscriptions and just said, we have the right to do this, regardless of what your contract says. Here, it's an opt-in for you, whether you want to be in the subscription. I think the key difference is that here it's really seen as a plus. It's expanding your market penetration and driving up your royalties. And I think that was not the perception with Cengage Unlimited. Okay, so Kindle Unlimited, and really if you have experience with this, they have a formula for calculating royalties on the subscription services of Kindle Unlimited. And it's based on page counts. You get one payment for, it's combined with your regular royalty payment for these subscription services. Customer can read the book as many times as they want, but your page counts are just based on the first time they read it. And so they calculate it they put all the monies earned on these into a royalty fund, and then they calculate it out, and you can read it on the slide, or I can read it to you if you can't see it. But basically, if an author has a 100-page book that was borrowed and read completely 100 times, if there was a $10 million fund of earnings, they would earn $1,000 on that. And they divide the 10 million by the total pages, for this author, divided by the total pages read of the authors in the fund. Okay, so that's kind of a very brief overview of self-publishing. It sounds like not too many people have dipped their toe into that water, but if anybody who has self-published wants to weigh in or add flavor to these bare bones, that'd be great. And if not, we'll keep going. Yeah.
Kindle Unlimited royalties are very small compared to actually having someone buy the book.
Yep.
Pennies versus dollars.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess the counter is that for somebody who is a subscriber to Kindle Unlimited, they might never buy the book outside of that universe. But it's hard to know. But it's a cost decision for the author. All right, so if we're ready to move on from self-publishing, we want to go into the Wild West, open educational resources. So obviously the goal, the reason for the creation of OER was mass distribution and accessibility. It truly is a noble cause for which it was created. You're all teachers and distributors of knowledge, first and foremost, And there's no question, these systems have brought down barriers to entry for teachers, instructors, and students. I mean, there are no question, there are a lot of implications about quality, first and foremost. You know, anybody, this is like YouTube for textbook materials, and we all, if we go to YouTube, can see a wide variety of quality, how reliable anything you're seeing there is, you know, how often it's updated, is it checked? And of course, there's a significant impact on the market for textbooks. But, you know, depending on your goals and drives, the benefits of OER could outweigh those things. So, you know, for me, I'm going to go through this with a legal lens. Free to the world does not mean a free-for-all. So first, again, think about your hidden costs. Because again, if you're creating content and putting it in there, you are still responsible for what you're putting in. You're responsible for permissions. If anybody's assisting you, you're responsible for paying them. And also, there are terms and conditions that go with posting things on an OER platform. So, and likewise, there are terms and conditions for somebody who's accessing your content on the OER platforms. So let's start with when you post content to the OER platform, it's very similar to YouTube, and I think that makes it easy to understand. They are in fact set up as an internet service provider, so they take no responsibility for content that's on their website. They even have language that says, you know, we make no warranty that this will meet your requirements, that it will be error-free, you know, that your content will remain available. It's just, you put it up, it's like a YouTube platform. They make no warranties about the quality of what's going to be up there. They have to respond to takedown notices, copyright infringement takedown notices, just like YouTube does. And they also have nice language about we may change or amend this agreement from time to time. As long as you comply, we give you a license to use the platform, but we grant you no other rights other than that. But again, you want to read the terms on a fairly regular basis to make sure they haven't changed. And you know, they have language there. You represent, you have all rights in the educational materials you're posting. So they are absolved of responsibility. That's on you to get clearances. And remember that even if you are making it available for free, content that you're putting into your materials may not be offered on that same basis. So they may want payment for what you're including. Okay, so now you've put your content into OER, you've put your book in or your course materials, people are going to access it there. Most of these, what I've seen, is it's governed by a Creative Commons license. Creative Commons was created basically, you know, when the internet was really growing fast and software developers started, and they wanted to just get their software code out there and shared and used. And the need to go through a formal licensing process was just hampering everybody who just wanted to grow and share. So Creative Commons was created so that you can apply a license to your content and put it out there, and the world can just know on what terms they can use it. And by using it, you're agreeing to the terms of the license. So Creative Commons, and this is a misconception people have, it's not the same as public domain, okay? Public domain is something that truly belongs to the public. There are still authors who own the content that's governed by a Creative Commons license. And there are several versions of the Creative Commons license. And OER, I think some are more recommended than others, but ultimately it's up to you under what license you want to put your content when you put it in OER. So I'm going to start with the most restrictive, because I think that would be in most people's comfort zone, which is an attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives license. So this is considered a very restrictive Creative Commons license. You're only allowing others to download your works. They can share them with others. They can use them. And they have to credit you. There's always attribution obligations in these licenses. But they can't change your content. They can't create a derivative work based on your content. And they can't use it commercially. And I think that was very important to the creators of Creative Commons, is they wanted stuff to be able to circulate freely and not be charged for. And I would say all the licenses I'm going to talk about here have an attribution component. And think about copyright for a minute. Under copyright law, you are not required to give attribution to someone. That is not a legal violation of copyright law. However, if it's a term of the license, then that is a legal obligation, because now it's the contract that's governing your use. So they have to, if someone's going to take the content, they have to give attribution. Some other alternatives from OER, the broadest license is just a attribution license. Basically, others can take the content, distribute it, remix it, tweak it, build on your work. They can even use it in a commercial context, as long as they give you credit. So this is broadest, and they said it's recommended for maximum dissemination. I mean, you just don't care what's happening to your stuff. You just want to get it out there. And that makes sense if you're thinking about you have a part of code that other people can use and build into their materials. It probably makes less sense in the course materials context. So a slightly more limited version of that was the attribution non-commercial license that lets others use your work, but it has to be done in a non-commercial way. They can't do it for sales. And actually, going back to that attribution license, the broad one, which lets people use your work in a commercial way, that can be really tricky because you've put it out there under OER in part because you want to make it freely available. But if you do that attribution license where others can use it commercially, they can take your content, put it into a commercial product, and sell it. So now not only are you not earning money on what you've created, but they're undermining the whole purpose you had here, which was to make your stuff freely available. So, you know, for my money, I would say the non-commercial license is the better option. And then there's two options with the attribution non-commercial licenses. One is a share-alike license. So on whatever terms you've licensed it, their downstream licensing has to follow the model that you've put in. Others are, it has to be non-commercial, but they could change other parts of how they license it downstream. So that's kind of technical and confusing. I would say if you go to the Creative Commons website, they have nice explanations. They have the licenses, but they have plain English explanations of them as well. And when you're deciding if you want to go into OER and how you want to, on what license terms you want to put your content in there, to pick the one that really suits the situation. So that's sort of the overview of OER. Has anybody put their materials into OER or used OER materials? And I would love to hear your experience from all sides. And any legal questions, obviously.
I will share a longer story in a session tomorrow afternoon with my co-presenter, Jeannie. But I do have a book that is OER. It uses the least restrictive license, the CC BY. Happy to share that.
What was there a reason you chose that license versus others, or was it
it was partly because it's a remix, so it got very complicated when I was trying to piece licenses together, and the more restrictive they were, the more complicated that was going to get. So I completely understand the point about being careful with non-commercial. So far, I've been very happy with the least restrictive license.
Great. Yeah, it should suit your needs. I mean, that's.
I actually have a question, Brenda.
Yeah.
It's a little hard for me to imagine the circumstances where a work is made openly and freely available, but also has a commercialization potential. But if you didn't mind it being commercialized, you could still, am I right, that you could still use the restrictive one that says no commercial without going back to the author, and then the author can say, yeah, you can commercialize it, but I get a piece, right? In other words, the author could participate in the commercialization, but you'd need to have the non-commercialization license on there.
I'm not sure I follow. I mean, if it's a non-commercial license, they can't co-opt it into a commercial product.
Okay.
The least restrictive, you know,
I
your
guess
group
what
could
I'm
say that's great content. We're going to put it into our program.
Okay, I guess what I'm asking, is there a way for the author to say, well, I'm fine with it being commercially available, but if somebody figures out a way to I'm fine with it being freely available,
Yeah.
but if someone figures out something that they could commercialize it with, I want to be able to participate.
Right.
Is there a license within Creative Commons that would permit that?
I've not seen that,
Okay.
that if they commercialize it that way. Yeah, I think then you'd have to go into a separate negotiation.
Yeah, thanks.
And you'd have to learn about it. Yeah.
I've used, well, Wikimedia has a lot of images that are available under the least restrictive license, and I have put those into books that I have published.
Yeah.
And some of those are works of really fine artists who have their own business, but these particular images have been put in under Creative Commons, and I'm sure they must think of them as advertising with the attribution.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's kind of a perfect segue, but I mean, everything in here, all the images I've used in this PowerPoint, you know, I was able to import directly into PowerPoint, and some of them come with those attributions. So they're kind of messy looking, but you might see, you know, CC BY at the bottom of some of these images because they come with the images when you use them under Creative Commons.
Hi, my co-author has from time to time expressed real panic to me about open education resources in in the field of our book, and like they're just going to steal our complete market away from us. And my response has been, and I don't know if I'm right about this, that nobody's going to put years of work into a fully developed textbook like we're doing and then give it away for free. So we're really not, it's not an apples and apples comparison. And am I right about that?
I mean, it's not really a legal issue in that sense. You know, I think people have different reasons for wanting to put their content out there. If it could be that a professor has developed a great program and they just want as many students to use it as possible. And I think there have also been some foundation grants for OER materials. So that is a great option for getting your costs covered when you create OER, but they want to get it. It's like other grants, right? The goal is to get mass distribution of the outcomes of the grant.
And some states are actually giving grants now. I know in Maryland, they actually have an initiative where they will pay faculty to write OER. And I'm not sure how far it's going to go, but yeah.
I mean, I will say, if you have, a book in either direction, if you have OER materials and somebody tries to co-opt them and create a book, that is still a copyright infringement. You know, it's, well, I mean, governed by these licenses, but the reverse is true. If you have a textbook and they're trying to import you into or use your content in OER, that is a copyright violation. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes, that's what I've discovered. I was doing research and just randomly I found snatches from a competing text on OER. So it does happen that it's just everything is stripped, any kind of attribution, and it's posted up there.
Yeah. And in that case, you would have the recourse you could have is to file a DMCA takedown notice with OER, which I'm actually going to segue right into that. But basically, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act has a safe harbor for ISPs like YouTube, like OER, where they don't have to police the content as it gets posted. It's just too much. There's too much out there. They can't possibly look at everything and make a copyright analysis. But if they have to have a mechanism in place to allow people to complain if they think they're being infringed, and then look into it and take it down. So, I think, so I'm going to touch very briefly on a couple copyright-specific issues, but, really I think we've already woven them in here a lot. But, you want to think about copyright. Again, it's always protecting yourself and protecting others. How to protect your work from being infringed, how to make sure you don't infringe others. We'll do a 2-minute recap of the rights of a copyright holder. Now you'll see some of these messy attributions because I was moving slides around and the attribution didn't always go with it. But basically, it's the right to make copies, distribute copies, create derivative works, like a translation. And then if it's a visual work of art or a music, the right to perform or display. So we talked a little about licenses versus assignments. Basically, the license is the right to give permissions, but you're not transferring ownership. And when you think about all the rights a copyright holder has, just remember you can divide these up in all kinds of ways. There's the CC licenses we talked about. You can license part of your work, one or more rights of the work. It can be for a limited time or unlimited time, for free, for a fee, exclusive or non-exclusive. So everything we've been talking about these different licenses and the contracts you enter into, these are all governed by copyright law and the concept of licenses. And there's really no limit beyond your imagination of how to divvy up the rights of the copyright holder. So whether you self-publish, you publish a chapter in a journal, or you license your journal chapter to someone else for use, or you could license your own images from your book to iStock for someone else to use. Versus assignment, which has to be in writing. So when we have contracts, where it says, they commission the work and they're going to assign it to the publisher, you cannot assign a work in orally. That is only ever a license. It has to be done in writing. Okay, and now I think maybe we'll wrap up with registration, because this is the kind of, again, the thing the publisher used to take care of for people that now, especially if you're self-publishing or doing OER, and even if you're going to put it out on a very broad license, I would still say there's a lot of good reasons to register your work. First, it establishes you as the owner. Now, that should seem obvious. You're the author. You created it. Of course you're the owner. What I'm talking about is if you go to court someday and you have a registration, then the burden of proof shifts to the other side if they want to dispute your ownership. So registration is, default is to you as the actual owner. It's easy. It's a one-time, it takes you half an hour. It's not a great interface. They're working to I was at the Copyright Society earlier this week. There is a movement to finally update their registration process, but it can be figured out. One time, $55, and it registers the work forever. You don't have to renew it. I will say, if you register, say, your unpublished book, and then you go through a lot of revisions, you want to register it again to protect all the new content you've added in, because you only protect what you actually deposit with the Copyright Office. And the reason, and I think you guys all raised, the way people have experienced infringement in different areas, you can't sue someone without a registration. So the Supreme Court actually just reaffirmed this principle. You have to have an actual registration in hand before you can go to court to sue someone. And once you do, you are now potentially entitled to attorney's fees that you can get back and statutory damages. So actual damages showing, your market harm in a copyright case can be very difficult to do and can often be very small. If it's on OER, there might be no actual damages. Statutory damages is where the Copyright Act sets certain amounts. For infringement per work, you can get $35,000. And the other reason, oh yeah.
I just have a quick question about that. If you did not register your copyright, but you have copyright to it, and you find that somebody else took parts of it, can you then go ahead and register it and then pursue legal action with that?
You can, but not for the past infringement.
Okay.
So it's going forward. And then I would say, apart from the registration, there's also the copyright notice, which is just this Copyright 2019, Brenda Ulrich, all rights reserved. You can copy that language. I give you all a license. Put it freely on your materials. I would suggest changing the name. Where to put it? On anything you publish. Books, articles, PowerPoint presentations, class materials. Why bother? Because as you all know, the internet is perceived to be this Wild West where everything is free for the taking. So even just putting people on notice reduces the likelihood of infringement. Because if they see it, they'll say, oh, this person's actually asserting ownership in their work. They don't want me to just take it. Class materials, a lot of students post things without consent from their professors to Coursera or wherever else. So having that notice there, again, it educates people. The other reason is that it's harder then for somebody to say the infringement wasn't willful, because if you saw that notice and you still went ahead and did it, you can say, well, I didn't know. Now you can prove willfulness, and you can get greater damages for that. So I think go forth and register and publish.
Maybe have time for one more question.
My understanding is if you write it and it's time-stamped in your computer, it is automatically copyrighted. So if I write that, is that enough?
It is protected by copyright law. So yes, I mean, as soon as something is in a fixed format, even if it's not time-stamped, it is protected by copyright law. The problem is, without a registration, that just doesn't get you very far. Somebody can't infringe it, but your actual ability to do something about it is quite limited.
Thank you so much, Brenda.
Thank you.